So as you can see, it by default has this camera button selected, and these are the scene tools. Now the scene tools are all the settings for your rendering and the render resolution and other performance type things. Now if we go into camera mode, and I'll just position it so everything's in view, you can see that the resolution by default is set to 1080p, but down here it's only set to 50% of 1080p. So if you set it to 100, then it'll be full 1080p, and I think 75 is 720p. So if we change this back to 50 and we render, you can see this. But if we go back to 100%, you can see that the image is much more high resolution and bigger, and took a tad bit longer to render. Probably wasn't very noticeable this time, but it adds a lot to the render time if you have a complex scene. Now over here you can see the frames of the animation. If you're making an animation, then you can change the start and ending frames when you animate your scene, and the frame rate. Now the higher frames you have, the more frames it's going to have to capture in a second. So that's important. Now down here we have, motion blur, shading. A lot of these aren't very important at the moment if you're going to be rendering stills or anything. I usually don't mess with any of these. Over here we have the layers, and you aren't going to need these unless you're doing compositing. Over here we have the, I guess this is, what is this? The scene, or wait, the scene tools. Oh, these are the render tools, these are the scene tools, and to be quite honest, I don't really go to this panel that much. There's not a whole lot here. There's simplify, and that will just overall simplify your entire scene, the max amount of subdivisions you can have and such, but I also never really use that either. Now in the world tools, this panel right here, you can see first thing is this dark gray color. As you can see, if you render this, it's the same exact dark gray color you get over here. So if you go to this right here, you can select any color you want. So now I'll just make it a light blue, and there we have it rendered right here. Now this little box right here, blend sky, will open up a whole new color. As you can see, it grays out. Now you can see that it goes from blue to black. So let's just make this light blue and this a darker blue. So now it looks like a sky. That's not really how you go about rendering a sky usually, but just showing you the different uses for this. Now, before I show you these other ones real quick, let me go back into the 3D viewport and we'll add a cube. How I made this little add menu just appear was by pressing Shift A, by the way. And I'll just scale this plane up that I just added. And then we'll go back and render. So by default you can see that the render settings don't look very good. In fact, they look terrible. The shadows are completely black, and I don't know, it just looks kind of gross. Now where this light is actually coming from is this light right here. This is the light of the scene. You can have more than one, and you don't have to use this light. You can just delete it. But as you can see, if you move this around, it'll affect the shadows. Anyway, the reason I added the plane was so you could see these dark shadows. Right here, ambient occlusion is sort of the key to this problem. With ambient occlusions checked, it will make the shadows based on their distance from the object. So the shadow right up here on the cube will be darker than when it's back here, and that's realistic. However, I'm going to set this factor of the ambient occlusion over here down to about 50 or so. So now you can see that the shadows are much lighter and look a little more realistic, as well as the shading on the objects themselves. However, if you zoom in, you can see this graininess to it, and to get rid of the graininess you just have to increase the samples. And the more samples Blender takes for its shading, obviously the longer the render time will be, as well as having ambient occlusion on in general increases the render time, but if you change this to 15 or so, it'll be less noticeable. But as you can see, it's taking much longer to render than usual. In fact, if you just completely turn ambient occlusion off, you can see how much faster it just renders. So these are sort of settings that you'd probably want to keep off until a final render of your scene. Now these two, environmental lighting and indirect lighting, I'm not really going to cover those, and to be honest, at the moment they're not very important anyway, because they're kind of still in their early stages and they just don't work as well as you want them to. For environmental lighting, it'll sort of give lighting all around every object, and if you have it on, you can see that you can make it the sky color or the sky texture if you have a texture in your background, or just white. For indirect lighting is sort of, it's when light bounces off objects and refracts onto other things. Now if you have this on, as you can see, you can't do anything with it yet, because it says it only works with approximate gather method. So if you go down here to gather and you change it to approximate, now we can change these settings. But we don't like approximate. You want ray trace to be your gather method, because ray trace is when it accurately makes the shadows and lighting. Approximate is just sort of getting it generally, but if you want more accurate shading, then you want ray trace activated. So that's one reason why indirect lighting isn't very good. Another reason is that when light bounces off an object, it usually takes some of the object's color with it. But with this indirect lighting, it doesn't do that. It will only take the color of the light source and bounce it off. So if you have a red object and a white light, normally the light that would bounce off the red object would be red. That's why if you go into a red room, all the white things in the room will be slightly red, and everything will be slightly red. But if you had a red room in Blender and you had indirect lighting on, then it would just be white with a little bit more brightness. So it's not worth the render time, and there are ways to fake all this sort of stuff anyway, and it probably looks better in the end. So just stay away from environment lighting and indirect lighting at the moment, until the newer versions are released. They're going to have a new render engine that is unbiased. So that pretty much covers everything in this panel. Now if we go to the Object tab, I'm going to go back and select this cube. Then you can see here all sorts of things. It'll show the transform, just like if you have N open, delta transform locks. Don't use a whole lot of these. One of these I do use is the maximum display type. If you go here into the 3D window and you click this, then you can show different types of display. Bounding box is just the boundaries of the object in general. Wireframe is all the polygons shown in wireframe mode. Solid is what it starts at by default, and textured has better lighting and shading for the 3D viewport, and also shows any textures that you have applied, so you can see them in the 3D view and know what they look like. However, if you have an extremely high polygon object, it will slow down the render, or it'll slow down the viewport. So if, say, this object was very, very high polygon, but I still wanted to see everything in solid mode, but it was just slowing it down so much that you couldn't work with it. You could take this object right here in specific and go to display and change the type, which will this will change the object's maximum draw type. So if you don't want it to show solid or textured, then you can just click wired, and now it won't be lagging your viewport anymore. But to be honest, I'm working on a laptop and it gets pretty hot, so even having a super high wireframe to the point where this would all be orange could slow down my computer, so then you can just change it to bounds. If you have like displacement maps or a very high polygon sculpted mesh in your scene, then you probably want it set to this while you're in the 3D viewport. And that's all I'm going to show you for this. Now this is the Constraints tab, where you can add sorts of constraints, and what constraints do is makes the object, it can limit the object's movement, rotation, or make it track a certain object, make it look at something. And constraints are very handy for animation. Say if you made a robot and you wanted the robot arm to have some pistons or rotating things on him while it moved, and if you had a good constraint system set up, Blender would do it itself when you move the robot's arm. So that way you wouldn't have to animate all the pistons and the rotating objects as well as the arm. So constraints are handy. And modifiers will change an object based on what the modifier does. If you click on here, then you'll see all sorts of things. The most commonly used modifiers are probably subdivision surface, array, mirror. I use multi-resolution a decent amount. Probably displace. And a lot of these armatures, or not armatures, a lot of these modifiers actually kind of apply themselves depending on what you do. So I'll just add a subdivision surface real quick. So as you can see, the subdivision surface increased the amount of polygons. It quadrupled the amount. And with every time you click this, it quadruples the amount. And this amount, the polygon amount, can increase very fast. If you have 1 polygon, it will change to 4. But, you know, if you have like 1,000,000, then it will change to 4,000,000. And that's a lot of polygons to change in just one click. So you have to be careful how many polygons you have set up in the 3D view. The good thing about this is, in the view you can have it set to 1 or none, but in the render you can have it set to 2. So right now it shows as none, but if I render it real quick, now you can see all the little polygons that should be there in the viewport. Now as you can see, I should have kept that up. It's kind of blocky looking, even though there's a high amount of polygons. Now this is where that smooth shading I told you about comes in handy. Now if we render it, there we go. So as you can see, this is about as high polygon as you'd need an object to be. Don't be fooled, there's not so many polygons in an object that like they'd be microscopic. That's actually not the way things are done. If you have enough polygons to make your object look smooth, then your job is done. You don't want any more polygons than you need. Even though Pixar makes animations that look similar to real life, they don't have 4,000,000 polygons in each of their characters. That's insane. They probably only have 30,000 at most. So anyway, moving on. Now if we go into this object data tab, you can see a bunch of list type things. Vertex group, shape keys, UV texture, vertex colors. Not really going to cover any of these, but, well, the vertex group is if you add a group of vertices, pretty much. That's all. By default, everything is selected, but imagine you have a character's head and you want hair to be coming out of them. If you go to the hair particles, it'll ask you for a vertex group. If you don't have it, by default it'll just use the entire object. However, if you want it just to come out of the top of their head, then you'd make a vertex group of just the top of their head. So if I press C, then I can bring up this and select based on everything. based on what I click within this sphere. So I'll just kind of select around randomly. And then I can add a new vertex group and assign it to this. So now hair would just grow out of that part I just made if I had it set to this name, group. Now a shape key is good for animation. A shape key will deform an object based on the value you have it set to. So if you add a shape key, by default it will add this basis one. You don't want to mess with the basis. Now if we add another shape key, the basis is this object right here. This is the object everything will morph from. This will be the morph itself, and you can have as many shape keys as you want. I'm just going to go into proportional editing and just drag out a vertice. Well, actually I did that wrong. Set the value over here to... Oh wait, no, I didn't do it wrong. Okay. So as you can see, it stretches out, and this is good if you have mouth animations you want to do and such. That's about all I'll do over here. Now, this panel right here, the material, this is probably the most important one, the one you're going to be using the most. This is actually affecting the color and the way the object appears in the render. This has to do everything with it being reflective, or it being transparent, or the color of it. Everything can be edited from here. So as an example, I'll make this green, and now it's green. So the diffuse color affects the actual color of the object. Now specular is the shininess, pretty much. So you can increase the shininess or you can lower the shininess. Now you have to know how shiny an object has to be, because that's kind of a big problem with renders if an object doesn't have the specularity it should have. You know, if you have a carpet or something or fabric, you don't want it to be shiny. But if you have glass, you don't want it to be dull or diffused. The hardness will show how much it kind of spreads out. As you can see, it kind of fades in. But if you increase the hardness, it'll just be a very, very sharp shininess, and this is helpful for like glass or something. But maybe if you had rubber, you probably want it to be a little bit softer. Now if you go down here to the shading, then you can change the emit value, how much it emits. So if you render this now it looks kind of like a glowing radioactive cube. Now, like I said, with Blender's render engine not being the greatest with its lighting, in most render engines you probably see light coming off of this cube because it has an emit value, but it's not going to do that in this render engine. You could use an external render engine, or you could fake it, and I'll make a lighting tutorial telling you different lighting techniques. I'm going to change the emit value back to 0. So here we have transparency. So there are two main types of transparency: Z transparency and ray trace. With ray trace, the light will go through and refract through the cube, and that results in a distortion in the render. Now, distortion is accurate to real life. Say if you have an ocean or something, that's what the rippling wave effect looks like. It's refracting the environment. However, if you have Z transparency, all it will do is just make it completely clear, and it will just be something you can see through. Now, both of them are handy in a render, even though technically I guess everything's ray traced in a way. Z transparency is also completely helpful in a lot of renders. Say if you have a balloon, you can see through balloons, but balloons don't really distort the environment, so it would save you time just to have it set to Z transparency. Now here's some options: traceable, use mist, traceable. If you have traceable off, then you can see it doesn't cast a shadow. That could be handy for something. Can't really name anything. Receive shadows and receive transparent. Receive transparent means, well, actually no, I'll just get into that when I cover transparent materials. Now in this tab you can edit the textures, and the textures are directly related to the material. So if you have, say, like a picture of a brick wall or something, and you want that to be on this flat plane so it will look like the plane is a brick wall, then you go down here to image or movie, and then you open up the picture of the brick wall, and then you set the coordinates if you want them generated or if you want them UV unwrapped, or any of these, but I usually use generated or UV. And I'll cover UV unwrapping in another tutorial as well. And then now down here you can set how much color it's at. It'll be black and white or more transparent looking if you set color down, or you can turn it off. There are multiple ways to use a texture. It doesn't have to just kind of show up. You can use texture to affect the normal value, displacement, or how much specularity an object has at a specific area. But I'll also cover how to do that once again in another tutorial. Now if we go up here, we have the particles tab, and what this will do is emit little particles out of the cube, or particles also work with hair too. So if you want to add hair, then you add the particle system and you change it from emitter to hair. And as you can see, there's some kind of ugly hair coming out of it right now, but I'm not going to get into any of these settings because they get pretty complicated after a while. And here are the physics simulations that you can add to an object. You can add a force field, which it could give it like wind or magnetic powers, so anything that's also with some of these force fields maybe it would attract to it or something. That way you wouldn't have to animate everything, and everything would be done using physics, and it would probably look more realistic in the end anyway. Soft body is sort of mesh. It deforms the mesh based on like what it hits. So Jello keeps its shape, but it jiggles around. So if you wanted to make Jello, then you'd use a soft body simulation. Collision, that just means it will collide with other objects. You have to have this selected on any object you want anything to collide with. It won't just collide by default. Fluid for fluid simulation, cloth simulation, and smoke for smoke simulation. And I'll also cover all these in another tutorial. But I think that's it for now. I hope you have learned a little bit about navigating and using Blender for your first time. And I will be making more focused tutorials on specific things in the future. Well, that's about it. See you next time.